right, good afternoon. My name is Tech Sergeant Guthrie. I am the Law Office Manager for United States Cybercom OSJA, and I have the great pleasure to introduce our next Fireside Chat. With us today, we have Mr. Jim Lewis, who is a staple lecturer for us here at the Legal Conference. He offers invaluable perspective and insight on remote sensing, encryption, high-tech exports, and cybersecurity. He is the Senior Vice President, Pritzker Chair, and Director of Strategic Technologies Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He also serves as the Senior Member for United Nations Groups of Government Experts on Infosecurity. This bushy-haired gentleman here is a very special member. He is very special in our hearts, and he is one of the lead architects of this legal conference. Lieutenant Colonel retired Kurt Sanger was the former Deputy SJA at U.S. Cyber Command, as well as being the Chief of National Security Law, the Chief of Policy, the Chief of Legislative Affairs, and the SJA of Marine Corps Force Cyber, with various assignments abroad to include Afghanistan for deployed units. He's been an instructor for the U.S. Marine Corps University, National Defense University, and has been my former supervisor. So I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you, sir, for having a meaningful impact on my life and my career. He is also now the director of the Integrated Cybersecurity Partners. He's a senior associate for the Strategic Technical Program with the Center of Strategic International Studies. And he is a cybersecurity board member and advisor for the Cowbell Cyber Insurance. Everyone, Mr. Kurt Sanger and Mr. Jim Lewis.
If you're on the polymer, we clap.
We'll clap for you.
Are we live?
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, which I did not expect and greatly appreciate. It was a pleasure to work with you, and it's great to be back with the office, and especially in person with this audience. But I want to focus, of course, on you, Jim. And if you give me one moment, we've already had the introduction, but I want to thank you publicly and personally for the mentorship and friendship over the years. Jim was often the first call that I would make when we had an issue that involved the history and the strategic and political and diplomatic arenas of cyberspace operations. And you were a mentor to many, but through your mentorship to me, had a great influence over Cyber Command and the SJA office, and a positive influence. And I'm certain that a word or two of yours probably still exists in the legacy legal analyses that we have for our operations. So thank you for your mentorship and leadership and for being here today.
So I used to teach at the Naval Academy, and the kids would always say, and I was told I couldn't call them kids, they'd say, tell us about the wars you were in. And I'd say, why do you want to hear about the Trojan War? So, so it's been a while, but thanks for having me back. It's always a good sign when they invite you back.
Well, you were the unanimous most valuable player of the 2018 Cybercom Legal Conference. So I can, Gary Corn, I can speak for the office on that, right? MVP. So let me reward your hard work and performance with a softball question to start out. Can democracies compete in the information environment without sacrificing essential elements and characteristics of democracies? In other words, does technology pose risk to the values that are protected by the U.S. Constitution?
And to be fair to the audience, we should say that he sent me the questions in advance, so I had time to think about this one. And so in the long term, I think democracies do have an advantage. I mean, one of the problems for dictatorships is, we're seeing it in Russia. People are afraid to tell the boss it's a bad idea, right? In the near term, though, there's two incidences of democracies in the U.S. of democracies restricting speech. One was Lincoln during the Civil War. One was Roosevelt during World War II. So we have done it in crises, but the level of crisis has to be much higher. Beyond that, they used to talk about the marketplace of ideas. I started calling it the flea market of ideas, but thanks to social media. I think it'll work. I think we can keep doing what we're doing. I'm very optimistic.
No, that's good to hear, because of more through influence operations and cyberspace operations that there are challenges just in the very nature of democracy and what the First Amendment protects, that allows our adversaries to have an influence here that it's a asymmetric advantage for them.
Mm-hmm.
So, next softball question, Stuxnet. Of course, I was not in the cyberspace operations game at the time of Stuxnet. At the time it was executed or discovered, and I have absolutely no idea who was behind it. But did the perpetrators perhaps open a Pandora's box and give an opening to our adversaries by conducting this very technical operation that was the first of its kind, at least the first that was discovered, against a very sensitive target in Iran's nuclear capabilities? What was the long-term impact, and did it maybe open up avenues for our adversaries that would be harder for them to take had it not been opened?
And so I should say to start that I talk to a lot of foreigners. I fill out some forum every couple weeks. And this comes from conversations with countries around the world. And I think Stuxnet is kind of in the rearview mirror for them. I mean, maybe it was a game changer when it happened, but it's now people still refer to Snowden. And so the Europeans in particular are still grumpy about Snowden. But Stuxnet doesn't come up. It was so long ago. Maybe it did open Pandora's box then, but at this point so many things have happened that it's not top of the list when you talk to other countries.
I guess it would still be important for democracies to think about what our operations, what example they may set for our adversaries, and that something that we do might make it that much more palatable for them.
I kind of wonder if we've moved beyond that, where there was a point maybe 10 years ago where the Russians and the Chinese, and I suppose we could throw the Iranians in there, kind of cared what we thought, and they made a decision some years ago that we were on the way out. They were wrong. They made a decision that we were on the way out, and they didn't have to pay attention to us anymore. So they're forging ahead their own path without necessarily looking at precedent. The Chinese will use precedent to defend themselves. So why are you guys complaining? You do it to us all the time. So we don't fly balloons over China. But no, we're in a different phase here with our opponents, and I think precedent is less important to them.
Oh, that's great. And the Russians, of course, they're going to do what they're going to do, regardless of what we do. Is that?
Chinese too. I mean, they feel now like that they're on the winning side, and so time is going to play out in their favor. So precedent was important a few years ago. It's less important now.
So what are the most important and effective tools of national power that are not technical in nature that support cybersecurity operations for us? So diplomacy, sanctions, any of these other tools that might help us protect our cybersecurity that are not technical.
So we probably will talk about Ukraine a lot because there is a precedent that people are looking at. And the thing that's been interesting there is it's a global debate in some ways, and you have to capture the global narrative. And we have some advantages in that, not necessarily the government, but I think the ability to shape the narrative, the other side worries about that a lot, and they put a lot of effort into trying to shape the narrative in ways that favor them. So I think the biggest tool we have now is, we're in I was thinking about it with Ukraine. It's in some ways, it's not the first internet war or the first cyber war, but it is the level of connectivity is so high. You have satellite, you have fiber, you have mobile, you have basic internet. You create this connected environment that lets you shape politics outside your borders, and so there's a lot of struggle now. We have sort of an innate advantage. I mean, very few people, maybe only one person defects to Russia. Maybe two, I take that back, right? So we still are attractive in a way, but I think the key tool for us is how do we shape that messaging. We're not doing 100% great job. I mean, if you look at the position of African countries, Asian countries, Middle Eastern countries, the Russians have done pretty good at influence, so we need to pick up our game, but we have some innate advantages. And I'd say that's the main tool, is the struggle for this global narrative.
So in preparing for today, if you go to Jim's biography page at CSIS and his writings page, it goes back all the way to 2007. I know you were writing before then, but that was all I had time to go back to, and we're only going to scratch the surface. I've got 2 hours worth of questions for only 40 minutes today.
So we're going to talk really fast.
Yeah. But I encourage everyone to go back and look at the history of some of these things. One of the things that I'll start with, you wrote in 2022, a useful first step for an effective use of persistent engagement and defend forward is to define the desired end state. That the United States has not done this reflects larger strategic shortcomings. Cyber action unconnected to foreign policy and strategic goals will produce desultory results and not improve our situation. Is the U.S. any closer to defining an end state, and what guiding end state would you recommend?
So I think one benefit we've gotten from the conflict we're in is that we were a little unfocused in some ways in the strategic competition. The Chinese and the Russians have helped us focus. So we are in a better position. We know, it's not clear to me that everyone outside of Washington knows when I see some of the TikTok debates, but most people inside know we're in a contest, and that has helped shape our strategy, help improve our strategy. So yeah, I think we're better off. We now have a goal, which is not to let the Chinese win.
Always good to have an adversary, right? It got us through the Cold War, didn't it?
Well, and look at, some of you might have seen where the Dutch agreed to, they have a company called ASML that makes a very precise, extreme ultraviolet chip making machine. It's the only one you can get in the world. And talking to the Dutch originally, they were saying, we understand you guys don't like China and we want to block China, but we're not going to turn off the tap on our sales of these equipments, without which you cannot make advanced chips. And I think what happened is that the political level and the Dutch government said, now is not the time to upset NATO. So having opponents who irritate people and do bad things has helped focus and improve our diplomacy.
Yeah. So speaking of diplomacy, we'll move on to norms and cyber norms and their impact on cybercom operations and operations generally. For those of us who have not read the entire bibliography as I did to prepare for today, just wanted to ask how you first got involved with the UN group of government experts, and if you could explain your role with. Yeah, this is not one of the questions that I asked.
I thought we said no biography.
I told you I was going off script. No, but it's important that to understand the context of your role and the part you played in the development of the norms.
This is the Trojan War. So in 1998, the Russians proposed in the UN that we needed a binding legal treaty to govern cyber and warfare. And that it's a sort of classic arms control trick. Your opponent has an advantage in one technology. You propose an agreement to restrict them and not yourself. Okay, so what else is new? And weirdly enough, a group of American academics endorsed the Russian proposal. And I thought, that's really a bad idea. What is the alternative to a legally binding convention? And the model I looked at, based on some work I'd done before, was the Missile Technology Control Regime, which it's not binding, it's very effective, and it has norms of behavior. So norms were an alternative to a binding legal convention. The theory was, when we started doing this 12 years ago, that it was a first step towards a binding legal convention, that we would agree on norms and confidence building measures, and that would lead us eventually to a formal convention. If anything, we've gone the other way, starting in the last 5 years or so. But that was the theory, is we're not ready for a convention. Any Russian convention is probably a bad one. They still are proposing it, by the way. And so that was the idea, is what can we learn from the non-proliferation world?
So there was a challenge at Cyber Command that when nations want to use force, there's a mechanism and there's a standard to do that under the UN Charter, whether it's self-defense or the sanction of the Security Council. When we want to use countermeasures, there is a process for that. But for norms, you can either observe them or you don't observe them. But the circumstances under which you choose not to observe them for a nation, it's not spelled out in the same way that it is for countermeasures and the UN Charter. So To the extent that one commentator said Ukraine should still be observing the cyber norms vis-a-vis Russia after things escalated in 2022. So I just want to go back to what was the thought among the group of experts about when the norms may or may not apply, and how should we justify when we choose, any nation chooses not to observe a norm based on world circumstances such as the Ukraine conflict?
So a little history there. The first agreement was in 2010, and it said that it was only about 15 lines long. It said that we needed norms for responsible state behavior. We needed confidence-building measures to give people assurance that the norms were being observed. And the South Africans actually said, as the representatives of the developing world, we insist that you put capacity building in. It wasn't in the original document. So that was it. That's all 2010 says, is norms, CBMs, capacity building. In 2013, which was round 3 or round 4, people introduced the idea of international law. And so one of the big debates then was, does international law apply in cyberspace? And so one of the positive outcomes of the 2013 and 2015 discussions is nations accepted international law applied, the UN Charter applied, and that created a sense that international humanitarian law, the laws of armed conflict, the Article 24, Article 51, those shape what we do in cyberspace. But there was what I thought was a clear line, apparently not clear enough, between conflict and not conflict. This is always murky in cyberspace. There's a clear line between use of force and coercive measures, right? Let's just call them that. I wrote what I thought was a brilliant definition of use of force, and it was rejected in about 5 minutes by all the countries in the room. And afterwards, I said to one of our co-stars, why did you, and they said, look, our prime minister reserves the right to decide when something qualifies as force. But when you make that political decision, it's a threshold that's held pretty well. When you make that political decision that this is force, this is an armed attack, you're in a whole different ballgame, right? The norms weren't intended to apply to that. The norms were intended to walk us up to conflict. What does responsible state behavior look like when you're not in a conflict? And that's the intent. So I'm a little baffled by why people are saying, Ukraine is violating the norms. Sure looks like use of force to me. That's both 2.4 and 51.
Yeah. How about for other forms of competition? So say something where the nations involved are not using force, but they're conducting provocative cyberspace operations that either come close to or actually reflect that nation is not observing the norms, but is not necessarily illegal by the consensus of the international community. You can't resort to countermeasures then. All you can really do is stop observing the norms yourself. But there's the challenge of then you are, at least at the perception level of the international community, that you're doing the same thing that your adversary is doing, that they're both breaking the norms.
So what I did at the UN was I was advisor to the chairman of these groups. They're the ones who actually delivered agreement. I just helped. And so one trick is to pick a really strong chair for your negotiations. Another trick, more at my level, is, and you all know this, lawyers hate it, but you have to be ambiguous on some things. There's no way you're going to get the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, the British, the French to agree on something. So you paper over it with somewhat ambiguous language. One of them was, what about coercive acts? What about political interference? Espionage was always taken off the table in the very first meeting, which is there's some things we're not going to talk about. We're not going to talk about espionage, right? In this case, I think what happened is, if you think malicious action, I think that's the phrase we use. It's not defined, but it gives you a lot of space to say, this is a malicious act in cyberspace, and you agreed in these norms not to do it. That's as close as we could get. There are places where I don't remember it as clearly as I used to, but the Russians and the Chinese, for some reason, would not tolerate the laws, using the phrase laws of armed conflict. And the Chinese would always say, well, cyberspace is a domain of peace, right? And so we don't want to recognize the potential for armed conflict in cyberspace. If we agree with you that LOAC applies, it's legitimizing cyber warfare. That's what they still say that. So you had to paper around that to get even what we got.
Yeah, so this is a good practice point for the cybercom and cyber component and CNMF attorneys. The guy who was there at the beginning says that the norms, the rules, were written ambiguously on purpose. So when you have to go to the J3 or the commander with the phrase that every lawyer hates to deliver to a commander, it depends. This is why, because it was designed that way. So good thing to keep in your back pocket if you're at Cyber Command.
And so when I was a mere child, I met one of the people who drafted the UN Charter. And I asked him, why didn't you guys ever define armed attack? And he said, because we couldn't get agreement and because people want to preserve the political decision to decide what's an armed attack. So the political masters do not want precise definitions. They want to have that flexibility. That was a good lesson for me.
Yeah, and get that flexibility when you're offering the commander options too. So good guidance. Moving on with the norms. So Western democracies, the US and our allies, we could choose to develop norms independently, have our own agreement, and set the example through our operations. Or we could continue to work through the UN and the government group of experts and the OEWG. Do you recommend going on our own or sticking with the mechanisms that we have?
You have to play in the ball game, so that's number one. One of the reasons I left working for the UN is I was sitting up on the dais in front of the General Assembly and behind the chairman, and the thought popped randomly into my head. I wonder if this is how the people who were negotiating the Kellogg-Briand Pact felt. And so at that moment I thought, you're too cynical, you need to get out of here. We can't get out of the UN, we need to keep doing it. There's the OEWG. By the way, the OEWG was shocking. When they held the first one, I thought, I wonder if anyone will show up. The room was packed. I think 119 countries showed up out of 192. And they were good. I mean, if you look at some of the African countries, if you look at some of the Asian countries, South American countries, they had real cyber experts, and they wanted to engage in this. They want to talk about it. So we have to play in the UN. But there are limits to what can be done, given the position of the Russians and the Chinese. The Russians are very touchy about this. They even blackballed me at one point, which was kind of fun. There are alternative mechanisms that are being developed. And so if you look particularly at some of the White House initiatives, like the counter-ransomware initiatives, this is a new venue for agreement. And the reason they say, if you said this is a counter-China initiative, no one would come. If you say counter-ransomware, people will show up. But I think we are building new structures here that will create, if not norms, state practice on cyberspace, and that's probably the vehicle to watch.
So moving on to the recently
There's 30 countries, by the way, 32 or something, so it's not the world.
The National Cybersecurity Strategy, so again, going back and reading 15 plus years of things you've written about cyberspace, it's amazing. First of all, I defy anyone to find a swing and a miss for what's going on today from 15 years ago even. But, and I know you said you haven't read some of your stuff in a while either, but...
Who would?
Well, me. I guess that's it. But it'd be worth it for anybody who's operating in this space, especially because a lot of what you've written, and a lot of it from a long time ago, showed up in the National Cybersecurity Strategy this time around. So wanted to know what you thought about the strategy, what you liked about it, what you didn't like about it, what you wish there might have been more of.
So one thing, and I think it came up a little bit in General Nakasoni's remarks this morning, the central problem for international cybersecurity is how do you create accountability, right? And the argument that I had made and others was that to create accountability, you need to have consequences. And so I think they're starting to move towards that in the strategy. The strategy does good things. I noticed that you can use word search. It doesn't use the word deterrence, and I think that's because the people who wrote this strategy believe that deterrence doesn't work in cyberspace. It does use the word regulation, which is a big breakthrough for the U.S. It does talk about taking action against malicious actors. So I think those are things that are really good. What does international policy look like if it isn't based on deterrence? And it's a relief to me to get away from some of these Cold War strategic concepts. What does regulation look like? And I know you had Matt Eggers here earlier. I don't see if he's here, but hi Matt, there you are. You know, regulation has been a point of dispute since Dick Clark wrote PDD 63 in 1998. And so we're moving towards, we're behind, by the way, if you look at what the Australians do, if you look at what the Brits do, if you look at the European Union, not that they're always good examples, we will see some kind of regulation, and I think that will be an important, someone talked about shifting liability from the edge to the people who actually make this stuff. And a lot of this was driven by, a lot of the strategy was guided by SolarWinds, by Log4j, by some of the other incidents we had, that those hit the new team within weeks of their arrival. And when they looked at, for example, SolarWinds, some basic coding errors that were shocking to see, that nobody had looked closely at how the code was written. So saying maybe you should think about how you write code securely, and maybe NIST should come up with standards. I think a lot of what you're seeing in the strategy is a reaction to what was a very tough first year for these people with 3 or 4 big incidents, colonial pipelines. I think it's a good thing. In some ways, implementation will be hard. One thing I have said to folks is, you're running out of runway. I mean, this administration basically has about 16 months left. I hope that's enough time to do some of this stuff, and we'll see what we get. But in general, it's getting away from the old ideas that we've been pursuing since PDD 63, and I think that's a positive step. Sorry, long answer.
Well, you actually bumped into my next question, but I am going to read the quote that preceded the question because, Joseph, you smirked a little when I said that a lot of what you had written had made it into the National Cybersecurity Strategy. But in 2016, you wrote 2 principles should guide cybersecurity: creating consequences for foreign actors and incentivizing domestic actors to provide better cybersecurity. And those were 2 of the major themes of the strategy that came out in March.
So we have had a number of meetings with NATO allies to talk about, we have these norms, you can hold your applause, because the other side doesn't pay attention to them. So what would we do to make them pay attention? And the issues there do fall into the legal category. How do you establish political attribution? That's different from forensic attribution or from the attribution used in court. Political, a NATO ally put it to me this way: I need to be able to walk into my prime minister and say, I can't just say the Americans told me it was them. I can't do that anymore. So there's some fallout from some of the things we've done in the past. I need to be able to say, I am persuaded that it was the Russians who were responsible. That's political attribution. Once you do the attribution, once you get that political buy-in, what's the menu of consequences for activities? And that was, I think it was in one of the sessions today, or no, it was in the speech yesterday by the DOD
General Counsel.
Yeah. What is the proportional response to election interference? What is the proportional response to ransomware, when it's done by a state actor? I think we need to work through a menu of proportional responses. The strategy points in that direction, but that will be one of the challenges for my theory, and I think other people's theory, is if we don't respond, they will not stop. And so that's one good thing about this strategy, but now we have to say, okay, so what is a proportional response? What is a lawful response to a malicious action?
So we're only going to have a few more minutes before we get to Q&A, but want to ask about Ukraine real quickly. If the conflict were to end today, what would be the legacy or the lessons learned from the cyberspace operations to date?
Can we do a poll? How many of you thought the Russians would do so badly, right? So I was pretty much convinced, I think as a lot of people were, these guys are good. It turns out they're not good enough, right? And that's not for lack of trying, you all know that. Very active, they remain very active. So what we've learned from Ukraine is, first, that a well-conducted defense, and we don't have time to talk about all the parts, but the Ukrainians, they gave me a lecture once when I said it started with the invasions. And no, it started for us in 2014. So we've been in a cyber conflict with the Russians for years now. But a strong defense and an agile defense can be effective against even a skilled opponent. The Russians help by being disorganized and not thinking how to do things in a combined arms fashion. We may not be so lucky with the Chinese. That's something to think about. But I think that's what we learned from Ukraine is defense works really well. The other thing we learned is you have to capture the narrative, and that's also not a given because we haven't captured it everywhere in the world. You want the other side. The General Nakasone referred to the decision to release intelligence. That was really effective. Lots of countries I talked to, some of them will even start by saying, well, we didn't trust the Americans, but then when you released that intelligence and we saw that it was right, it's been a huge boost for our international influence. And I think that's one of the things we have to think about is what are the steps the Ukrainians did to construct an effective defense against a skillful opponent? What are the things that helped, and our activities were part of it, that helped shape the global narrative in ways that favored us?
So I've got 90 more minutes worth of questions,
Good.
but since I'm not going to be able to fit them all in, since I won't be able to fit them all in, I think we've got about 5 minutes. Open it up to Q&A from the audience, knowing that if you don't have questions, I've got a long way to go. Is that you, Rob?
Well, thanks so much. As always, Jim, very enlightening, and now I will go back and read some of those articles. So you mentioned the Russians are still trying to push the treaty or the idea of legally binding rules. You'll know that a few weeks ago at the UN, they more or less put that on the table. The text they've been pushing around for a decade, they've now had made into an official UN document, translated into 6 languages, and they've told at least the non-aligned movement, but I think told everyone else that they plan to bring a vote to the first committee as early as this fall. So I'm interested in your reading of what's the likelihood the Russians can win a vote at the first committee of the General Assembly in October to launch a treaty process. How do you see that? And how do you see what is I think a partial response from like-minded, including Canada, and the United States, and led by France, to create a program of action? And is that going to be sufficient to stop a Russian treaty? In the way that I think you've outlined, the development of voluntary non-binding norms has sort of given us 10 years of not having a treaty. But is the rubber going to hit the pavement this fall, in your view, Jim? I'd watch
first of all, I love the Russian text because it's got lines like, freedom of speech is guaranteed, comma, subject to national law. And it's like, no, Igor, you have not got the theory. But they still say stuff like that. I'd watch the Russian Cybercrime Convention in the 6th Committee. This is UN speak, which does law enforcement. I think that one, there's more support than I thought. And part of it is we need to come up with, we, the like-minded, need to come up with a credible alternative. The administration had something called the future wonderfulness of cyberspace or something like that. If if you do a nose count, about 2/3 of the UN voted against the US proposal. So we need to pick up our act. I'd watch cybercrime. People are worried about cybercrime in other countries, and so that one you might see the Russians do better. We got one at 12 o'clock there.
Oh. Sorry, please.
Thank you all for coming. Particularly in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, what, if any, incipient norms do you see emerging surrounding protecting civilian critical infrastructure from malicious activity generally, and then in the cyber context specifically?
The issue is whether we need to expand the existing norms, because the existing norms reiterate people's commitments to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to the laws, the international humanitarian law, to the idea, and there were long discussions about under what circumstances would it be improper to attack civilian targets. And I think that's what you'll probably see is not a new norm, we have plenty of norms, but more a clearer understanding of how they apply, how the laws that exist for physical conflict apply to cyberspace. And that was one of the goals all along, is we have a pretty good framework, legal framework, international framework. For physical conflict, how do we push it into cyberspace?
Yep.
I know that we were, and this kind of following up on the first question about kind of the UN being the game and playing the game in town, but what role do you think bodies like NATO or kind of more regional bodies might have in creating structures that, even if they wouldn't be able to be binding or, create enforcement mechanisms for some adversaries, could potentially create deterrent value if they came up with other kinds of frameworks for cyber activities?
So we can debate whether we're moving into a bifurcated world. I mean, there's some evidence yes, some evidence no. It's not going to be a Cold War where there was very little transfer between the two sides. But the UN is stuck, right? So we're not going to see progress there, at least this year and probably next year too. That means that people are turning to other venues. And so not only the ones you named, but things like AUKUS and the Quad, NATO. OSCE is kind of stuck because the Russians are in it. But the search for common understandings on how to respond to this will happen outside of the UN. NATO is a good place to look at. So I think that would be my answer. One more.
One more, sir.
What lessons can we learn from the 20 years of experience around cyber norms and cyber governance for other technology sectors, whether it's space or whether it's AI?
Well, there's two that come to mind, and the first is clarity, right? Clarity, and not only in the language, which I can probably partially guilty of along with some others, but also linking them to existing practice, existing state practice, that's what gives them force. And so if you look at space, if you look at AI, you might want to say, how can we extend current state practice, current international law into these venues? I had another lesson, I'll be darned if I can remember what it was. Say the question again, maybe it'll occur to me.
I was asking what are the lessons we can take from 20 years of norms development, norms engagement from cyber to other technologies?
I think those are the basic ones, is link them to state practice, link them to existing international law. When you start identifying the places where, say, the Geneva Convention doesn't work, it turns out to be a very small set. There are areas of ambiguity, and so this question of the threshold for the use of force is probably a good one to think about, is what qualifies as force. I saw yesterday there were remarks about the gray area. I'm not sure I like that term, but that's one of the lessons here, is the more you can link it to current practice, to existing law, and then identify where that doesn't work is helpful.
Great, so we will wrap up on that one. Jim, thank you again so much for being here.
Thank you.
And thanks to General Nagasone for hosting the show, Colonel Hayden, and Lieutenant Colonel Neiman for the invitation to us and Tech Sergeant Guthrie as you are about to retire, and this is my first post-retirement Cyber Command legal conference that I'm not involved in running. I have to tell you how wonderful it is to be here and not have to run the show. You have a lot to look forward to.
Well, thank you so much. I know everybody got a lot out of that. So thank you, Mr. Jim Lewis and Mr. Kurt Sanger. And we know we'll see you again next year. Everybody, we are on break for 15 minutes until 14.
In 2002, I wrote a piece called Assessing the Risk. That's still a bestseller. It has 500 citations. I laugh about it because I get notes from